Up to 5,300 soldiers are being made redundant from the army in the third wave of job cuts. Those whose jobs are at risk should have been informed today. The government says once again it wants to pick as many applicants for redundancy as possible, but some will almost certainly be told to leave despite not volunteering. Let's go live to Westminster and our reporter James Hirst.
Well, Kate, it's worth reminding people these are not new job cuts. These are part of the 20,000 posts that the Army was told to lose in the 2010 Defence Review and subsequent restructuring announced in 2011. That is little consolation for thousands of people today. And this third tranche is by far and away the biggest yet for the Army, and it is probably not the end of it either. The Army has already got smaller. 3,800 redundancy notices have been given out over the last 2 years. But this summer, up to 5,300 more soldiers will be told their career in the Army is coming to an end. Around 26,000 personnel are being considered for redundancy in this round, more than a quarter of the Army. They will be selected from more than 250 different job fields. Once again, it's a compulsory scheme, but people who want to leave are being asked to apply to express their interest. Those serving in Afghanistan on post-op tour leave or due to deploy in the autumn will be protected from compulsory redundancy. But because of the drawdown, it won't be clear until April who's actually going to deploy. The government says operations in Afghanistan will not be affected by these job losses. Those selected will leave between the end of this year and the middle of next. But today, the Shadow Defence Secretary called for the Defence Review to be reopened.
The government's Defence Review committed the UK to an army of 95,000, but didn't even mention Mali, Algeria, Tunisia, Nigeria or even Libya. The threats have increased, and yet the army has been cut to just 82,000, well below the previous promise.
Can we have an assurance that those selected for redundancy will not include any of those who have specialist skills, such as intelligence gathering, which would assist the achievement of the ambitious agenda announced for the Prime Minister yesterday?
I would say to my right honourable friend that in rebalancing the Army, the regular Army, for its new smaller size, we need to make sure we have the correct balance of skills within our armed forces, and we will attempt to do that, including intelligence personnel.
The reductions in the regular Army are meant to be made up for by doubling the number of reservists, but they aren't in place yet.
Boots on the ground. It's a well-worn phrase, but it's still an accurate one. Matter. We are going to be a fifth smaller than we were, which inevitably will reduce our ability to deploy this or that size of force.
Another tranche of redundancies is expected, and that could include Royal Navy and RAF medical personnel. But it is the Army that still has quite some way to go to get down to size. Now, although these are not new cuts, they represent around 1 in 20 British soldiers leaving the Army in the first half of next year. So earlier, I asked the Assistant Chief of General Staff, Maj General James Everard, whether the Army could cope with that scale of cut.
We knew it was coming. The future Army structure, Army 2020, takes account of the reduction in these numbers. And yes, we're absolutely positive that we can cope with these numbers.
It is more than are due to draw down from Afghanistan over the next year, though, isn't it?
It is, but of course we are seeing reducing numbers in Afghanistan now, and that will increase through to the end of combat mission in December 14. And partly the reason we've had, of course, these three tranches is so we could take account of the drawdown in operations.
People will be looking at this idea of drawdown in operations and looking at instability elsewhere in the world. Can the Army still do operations on a reduced size in the future?
Yes, and I think what's so interesting is the sort of world that we are now seeing emerging is a world that the future character of conflict work predicted, the future world that Army 2020 predicted. And when people look at the way that we intend to construct the Army, the adaptable force, adaptability is at the core of that proposal, and I think we'll be better placed to deal with these sort of threats.
Part of the adaptability is to introduce more reservists into the Army, but will those reservists be in place as these redundancies come into effect?
You're quite right, because people talk about the move down to an army of around about 82,000. I would talk about an integrated army of 112,000, bearing in mind we are going to be seeking more from the reserve. And yes, I'm confident we will get there with the reserve. Work's going on now. I'm responsible for both the Army 2020 and the reserves proposition. And you're right, it will take time to get them up to the right level of training and standards, but I'm pretty confident we're going to get there.
For the individuals who've been told today that they are in a redundancy field, what's your message to them?
Well, I think my message is that redundancy is never easy, and we deeply regret that sword of Damocles. I think the Army's Families Federation talked about that sense of uncertainty that you now have between now and June, unless of course you're an applicant, and I know some people will see this as an opportunity. But I go out and I speak to units. They understand the rationale, they understand the need to draw down to our new structure, and so my aim now is to make this process as smooth as possible.